because I think there is a natural progression towards realising the British state is over. And you don't need to. You can. I mean, it's like a lawn. I'm just struck when I was coming into Troon to see you've got the same wizened up looking grass that we've got over on the East Coast as well. You know, you can apply fertiliser and that helps the process, but if there isn't a natural process happening beneath it, it isn't enough on its own. And the natural process that's happening is that on absolutely every measurable count, Britain is sinking beneath the waves. So let's not panic too much, because I think the process is at work. And yes, Margot was right. The research that Craig DL has done within Commonweal suggests that the most powerful arguments are the ones, they're not arguments for starters, the most powerful discussions, as you were suggesting, are entirely ones that have some bond of friendship. How you were just, well, I presume you're still friends with your husband, but you talked about him talking to his friend. You know, it's working out from where you are. That's a real kind of centre for something, instead of the kind of slight remoteness, to be honest, of all media. You know, so, and the other thing he found was that people are very influenced by sort of influential people within their lives. Actually, that could be employers, it could be the local nurse, if you're somebody who, you know, is involved with the health service or needs services a lot. So that nearly everything of value, and this is another old, you know, thing that I feel very strongly, most things of value are local. Most opinion, you know, our lives are lived locally, but because Scotland has got this, like Britain, is a top-down society, we undervalue the very thing that makes us alive. And we live in communities that I wish we would recognise is where value is created. But because of the way Britain works, we take taxes, we pay them to Westminster through gritted teeth. They send some back to Scotland through gritted teeth. They send some to councils that are so large, nobody knows any councillors on them. And we call that local democracy. So we've got to unlearn some of these approaches, I think, and realise, as you were suggesting at the back, value is here. It's radiating around you, and you are the agents of change.
So you're just back from Iceland, just back today from Iceland?
Yes, about 3 hours ago.
Yeah. Before that you were at the Faroe Islands.
Yep.
Both trips were to produce films. What's the purpose of the films and why those particular places?
Well, I mean, I think the thing is seeing is believing, really. And if you think, wherever you grow up, you think is normal. I mean, I grew up in Northern Ireland. I thought a lot of very strange things were normal. When I was at school, we used to sit in classrooms that had thick sellotape crisscrossing the windows, so that if there was a bomb, the glass would come in one injury minimising chunk. And when I crossed the water here when I was 13 and went to a school in Glasgow with no sellotape, I was scared. Now that was my weird, but the point I'm trying to make is wherever you grow up you think is normal. So if you haven't spent time outside Britain, you think this is normal. You think it's normal to have a top-down democracy. You think it's normal to have privatised utilities, key functions of your life being bid over. We think it's normal, well, you just a bit of a shrug of the shoulders when someone tells you that all the best wind and alternative energy producing areas in Scotland are just not connected to the grid because the privatised company that's in charge of it hasn't thought that it's a kind of good economic proposition for 20 years. You shrug. What can you do? That's Britain. That's bollocks. That is so atypical of the way that modern democracies work. And if you spend your time here, you're a boiled frog. It slowly creeps up from your tootsies until you don't realise you have been Britanified or whatever it is, until you expect this to be the way that things work. It isn't the way things work. I mean, I don't know if some of you have maybe lived in different places in Europe, and you come back like a brick wall to here, and of course everybody thinks that's relatively normal. So the purpose of going to the Faroes or Iceland is twofold. Is to say that when you've got powers, you run things differently, and that countries who did not have the horrific experience of Margaret Thatcher privatising key aspects of our public lives, making the market more important than our society, happily, the countries that did not let that happen, because their values were so strong, they repelled those kinds of siren voices, those societies are more normal. That's what I think, when you scrape the crud off Scotland, that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for a social democracy. And it makes sense for us to then know a bit more about the other kids on the block who've been there, done it, and have got several t-shirts that they're going to lend us even. So that's what the interest is. I mean, the Faroes, unbelievable. 50,000 people sitting on 18 barren rocks between Iceland and the Shetlands. And they have many powers because in 1946, when there was probably about 30,000 of them, they voted for independence from Denmark. 30,000. What's the population of Troon? Sling in air. What have we got?
15,000.
Okay, sling in, I don't know, where else are we going to hide? Hello, Philippa. Okay, sling in Kilmarnock. Surely we're getting there by now. So that sort of population basically decided it could become independent. And they had a referendum, and the result was 50.7% yes, which sort of scared the bejesus out of everybody, including the Danish government. And the Danish government rapidly gave them the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. Now, you see, it's important you know this, because the next time you hear any old nonsense about this world's most powerfully devolved parliament thing, you just have to say 2 words, the Faroes. Because what they got in 1946 was all the usual stuff we've got, but they got full tax-raising powers. They got control over communications and, well, obviously not broadband at the time, but that became broadband. And as a result of that, the Faroes have the world's fastest 4G mobile broadband coverage, twice as fast as Singapore and South Korea. Anywhere you go there, you've got that coverage. And that's because they had the power, and I'm glad you're all sitting down mostly because this is shocking. The way they did it, their government told Faroese Telecom to do it. Shocking, eh? I mean, that's fiendishly complex, isn't it? You see, in Britain, you've got a privatised structure and you've got to get some company to go and see if it's worthwhile, and then they do a little bit of... It's incredibly complex. But when you get back to normal countries, they simply see what is possible and necessary for their people, and they tell their companies to do it. Bang! You end up with brilliant broadband. But other things they've got a university that teaches in Faroese, a language spoken by only 66,000 people in the world. That's about the same as Gaelic, but they all speak Faroese. And they're taught in Faroese. It's a very key point of their identity. So when Google Translate decided not to put Faroese onto their system, the Faroese decided not to get angry, but to do something quite creative, and they created Faroese Translate. And what happens is, if you put a word in, you get a video back from a genuine Faroese person using your word in a sentence for you, because they have 4G broadband. You can be sitting with downtime on a boat, ping, in comes a request on Faroese Translate. All the boys get up there and do a song. Then, having sort of managed to kind of push back on the Faroese Translate, they decided to take on Google Street View, because Street View wasn't showing the Faroese as even existing. So they created Google Faroese Sheep View, and they strapped cameras to the heads of 12 sheep and set them off, and they had solar panels going down their backs to power the cameras. I mean, what is not to like about these people? You love them already, don't you? And so the sheep are wandering around the Faroes, you know, over the edge of cliffs and all this sort of thing. They even ended up taking the sheep on day trips because it was becoming so popular. People wanted to see more of the Faroes via the sheep. They got 3 billion views. 3 billion views, right? So, there's 50,000 people there. Massive, massive publicity. And the most important thing is they got Google Street View to come to the Faroes.
So what is it about fail? What is it about
let me just finish for a second, Richard, because it's so important that people get this. Look at you. You all want to go to the Faroes now, don't you? Right. That's what going to other places and finding out what their normal is like. You begin to get not just the policy detail, but the sense of smedum. You know, the sense of, they challenge the sense of how you can use creativity. And the final thing about the Faroes that's just astonishing is that in 1946 they were also given the right to sign international treaties. Now that's the one, when anyone tries to tell you something about how powerful Holyrood is, does it have the right to sign international treaties? Because if it did, we would choose to remain in the EU. And what the Faroese did was the opposite, because 95% of their income is fishing related. When Denmark joined the EU in 1973, the Faroese just went nah, and they didn't join. And some of you, I sense, are of an age where you were around in 1973, potentially, albeit perhaps not forensically studying Danish politics, but you won't probably remember hearing that anyone died. It just peacefully went that way. So the Faroese is out of the EU while Denmark is in. Faroes is still a highly devolved, probably the most highly devolved parliament in the world, and they still want independence.
So what is it about the Faroe Islands, the people in the Faroe Islands, the people in Iceland, that make them able to do that and to seize those opportunities, and yet we don't?
Yes. I mean, there's probably several things about it. One is, I was also a trustee of the Island of Egg buyout, and islands have identity. You know, there's lots of downsides about being on islands, but the upside is there's a definition and a sense of identity is really strong, and the Faroes and Iceland have got it in spades. They're seafaring people. Now, this matters a lot. They risk their lives every day. You know, historically, fishing communities have had to have a lot of courage to exist. And so you've got a hunter-gatherer, hunters basically, has been the lifeblood of these countries. They're living in environments that are trying to kill them. I mean, the island of Iceland is actually trying to kill everybody on a daily waking basis. So that breeds a certain level of sort of feistiness. All of that put together, they realise that the only way they're going to make a success of things is to have as much power in their own hands as possible. And you just seem to keep tripping over that people can't even understand when you ask. We asked the Faroese, or the Icelanders, after the crash of 2008, did anybody feel a little bit worried to be kind of on your own with no safe haven, no larger entity to be part of? Let's say Denmark again. I mean, people will absolutely guffaw at that, because the way they turned things around after 2008 was that they used it as an opportunity. This is astonishing, but this is an outlook that they could have. When they finally realised that 2008, the crash, meant that Iceland was finally affordable. I spoke to somebody when we came in here, we were exchanging horror stories of how much things cost in Iceland. I remember the £13 packet of crisps, but you know, everyone's usually got those horror stories in terms of alcohol. But suddenly, because their Icelandic kroner crashed, you could actually hire a car in Iceland. I've been 5 times to Iceland and you couldn't afford it. So they thought, wait a minute, we could really turn things around. The Icelandair went to the government of Iceland and said, can we buy 20 planes? This is in the wake of being bankrupted and placed on the terrorism register by Gordon Brown. The Central Bank of Iceland was placed on the terrorism register along with Al-Qaeda. They'll never forgive him, except in a funny kind of way, they thank him. Because the fact that Gordon Brown crippled their society pretty well, because no one was going to lend to a terrorist state, and it meant they had to let their bad banks fail. They had to. They had to jail the bankers. They had to, because there was no alternative. And actually, those hard measures they took meant they came out the other end of it faster than we did, and they have new banks. So actually, those of them who have got a good sense of irony, and that's kind of about 95% of them, will actually say Gordon Brown did us a big favour, but we didn't realise it at the time. So, you know, there's all these things that are possible if you can duck and weave, if you can act quickly. The only benefit of being a small country is the ability to think on your feet and act quickly. Now, sometimes the Icelanders have acted out quickly, and they know that about themselves, but still, it's better than being stuck as the small part of a big bureaucratic country, being the small tail of a bureaucratic country. And that, I think, is what those little countries demonstrate so well.
Okay. Question down the back.
Two things. I wonder if you would perhaps talk about the significance of the Growth Commission. I don't mean whether you agree with it or not, just what is the significance of it?
I mean, don't utter heresy things like I don't like it at all.
Number two, I wonder, would you indulge me please in just, our local MP has just arrived, and I wonder if people would maybe just join me in giving her a round of applause.
Sit down. Well, yeah, not a lot happened really this week. Well, for those of you who are geeks and have obviously been watching Parley Live, you will have seen it. Now, Heather, my office manager, often says, I love it when your dander's up. I can tell you, as someone born in Belfast and an adopted Scot, on Tuesday night when we had 19 minutes to debate the entire devolution clause, the impact on Scotland, the power grab, and the impact on Northern Ireland, where I know how terrified people are of the undermining of the Good Friday Agreement, was an utter and absolute disgrace. And the Minister spoke for all of those 19 minutes. He took a few interventions, he wouldn't take my intervention. We then actually had longer in points of order, which went on for over an hour than we had had a chance to debate. And it's really important, if you're talking to people, that they understand what this week was about and what yesterday was about. At every stage of the EU withdrawal bill, we were promised by Mundell that he would bring amendments to the Clause 11 that was going to take powers to Westminster instead of to Holyrood. And it was always the next stage, not this stage, but the next stage. So in the second reading, it was going to come at committee. At committee, it was going to come at report. At report, it was going to come at the third reading. And then when it went to the Lords, we pointed out the SNP don't sit in the Lords. We don't take peerages. But not just us, not just Scotland's official party are excluded. Every single elected Scottish representative is not part of the debate of fashioning those amendments. And we were told, when it comes back from the Lords, there'll be lots of time to debate and amend this clause. Well, you saw it. Tuesday night, that was it. Those 19 minutes where the Minister spoke from the beginning to the end and no one else, that was what we got. Now, what they're saying today, because obviously what we did yesterday did at least drag the Secretary of State to the House today to make a statement, is, of course, he says, oh, well, you know, it was going to be 100-odd powers and now it's only 24 powers. So nothing to do with principle, just quantity. And what we saw was the Tories, who had also complained, the Tory Scottish MPs had complained about this clause. But when it was shrunk down a wee bit, somehow that whole principle disappeared. Once the Feiklings in Labour in Wales had collapsed, suddenly the Labour Party weren't interested. And if any of the people you speak to think, oh, I'm going to vote Corbyn, because they'll speak up for Scotland, you look on Tuesday night at how empty the Labour benches were. They'd all gone home. So that's precisely how much UK Labour will do for Scotland or Northern Ireland. They do not give a toss. Not one tiny toss. And the problem is if you look at those 24 powers, really important policy areas like fishing and agriculture, food standards, food safety, the geographical indicators, Scotch whisky, Scotch beef, Scotch lamb. What's all of this about? Procurement. This is about selling out the crown jewels of Scotland in our food and drink industry in a trade deal with America. That's what the 24 powers were all about. So people need to be conscious of that. So that was one side of what this week was about. And the other is the simple fact that not the SNP, not the Scottish Government, but the Scottish Parliament refused a legislative consent motion. And what happened today was the Secretary of State said tough. So what we see is consent is completely meaningless. What we mean by consent is just we'll ask you. Whether you say yes, no, or maybe we don't care. All that consent will mean is we will ask you. You will not have the power to agree or disagree. And the other thing is these powers will go for 7 years to Westminster. And during that time, neither Wales, Scotland nor Ireland can legislate for these areas that are held in Westminster. But England is not going to be held back in that way. England will only be under a political agreement to not do it, not a legal agreement not to do it. So any UK government could easily give advantage to farmers in England, to fishing fleets in England, while Scotland, Wales and Ireland would be held back. So make no mistake, there is no question that this is hollowing out Holyrood, that this is reversing the whole principle of devolution, that if something isn't specifically reserved, it's devolved. And that's what happened this week. And I can tell you, when I got home on Tuesday night, I wrote to our Chief Whip and said, now I understand how the Shinners feel. Frankly, I feel like going up the road. And that's how we felt yesterday. And what Ian was trying to do was to obstruct PMQs, to cause an emergency debate in the middle of PMQs. We didn't know that the Speaker would try and throw him out. The idea of this was all pre-planned. It wasn't. It was, right, okay, we're moving. Right, okay. Even poor wee Plaid Cymru didn't spot, because we were going, oh, did they not come with us? We thought they'd come with us. Simply, the idea that our leader would be thrown out of Westminster for trying to highlight the travesty of a debate that we had on Tuesday, and we would not follow, or that we would allow that travesty of a debate on Tuesday and just go, oh, hashtag, I'm really annoyed, I'm sorry. That's not acceptable. And I think there'll come a point where we look back and we realise this week, yesterday, the first domino fell. And they kicked it over themselves. And they have only themselves.
Well, can I be cheeky, Philippa? Because I was talking a bit about this before you got here. And kind of, I think a lot of people, you said there, what I think a lot of people were thinking, which is, you know, what are we doing here? And should we just decant up the road? Now, you've used that as a tactic once, and actually folk were back in. I think the MPs were back in a couple of hours later. Well, there was somebody on one of the committees, wasn't there?
No, I don't think anyone did committees. Stephen had to speak for us on the EU withdrawal bill, so he was in the chamber. We did turn up to vote, but none of us entered the chamber.
But I suppose the question is, would you consider withdrawing again?
I think you mean like permanently.
Well, I left that question.
Oh right. I think that we will have to think about what options are open to us. I certainly would be a great time to have Alex Salmond down, because there's nobody who knows the detail of Erskine May, which is the book of all the rules of Westminster, the way Alex Salmond does. Telling it that man would be able to come up with all sorts of ways, but certainly I can speak for myself. I've worked really hard over the last 3 years. I've tried to be constructive. As a breast cancer surgeon of 33 years, I have tried to contribute in a really generous and hard-working way to things that were going on. To the Health Committee, I'm on the Health Services Safety Investigation Branch Committee, trying to help things that will actually be for England. They're not for us. When you go to Westminster, you end up on a hamster wheel. I work about 90 to 100 hours a week. And an awful lot of that is just that you're sucked into this hamster wheel or washing machine. And I think we will be looking seriously at what it is we're doing, how much we will cooperate with what's going on down there, and how much effort we will be putting in that is not directly coming back to the people of Scotland. Because we have tried to be good parliamentarians, okay, the odd clapping and whatnot, but you know, we have worked really hard to be respected within Westminster. But what we saw after 3 years on Tuesday night is that counted for nothing. Neither the SNP nor Scotland were respected in this EU withdrawal bill in any sense of the word at all. And I would say that this week is an absolute change. We wouldn't withdraw completely because, frankly, they wouldn't care. Right now, they wouldn't care. They would just use the opportunity to railroad anything through. And while we can't outvote them, we can at least out-debate them. And that's important, that we are there putting Scotland's voice. But it will not be on the same basis as it's been up to now. Now, people keep writing on social media, we need a date, we can't start till we have a date. Can I tell you, when the date comes, and I don't think it'll be all that far away, you'll already be too late. Because the next independence campaign would be 6 months long at the most. That would be my estimate. It's not in my control, it's above my pay grade. But I would estimate it would not be longer than 6 months. You think back to 2013-14, whatever groups you were involved in, how long did it take to get them off the ground? How long did it take to design and print your first leaflet? So if people are not already holding meetings, knocking doors and talking to people before we have a date, this is just going to go right past us and we will have missed the most important opportunity. If you can't win independence for Scotland with the most incompetent, divided and idiotic government really since 1900 and something, and with everything that's being done to Scotland, from being dragged out of the EU to having our parliament hollowed out, then I don't think we could ever win it. So my call to people is, with the first domino falling this week, I consider this the start of the campaign, and people just need to get the hell on with it.
What happens if Mrs May turns around and says, no, now's not the time?
Well, Mrs May's already pulled that one. Obviously, there's precedent in the sense of David Cameron agreeing to it. So it's always a wee bit harder to say no when there's been a previous agreement. She got away with that now is not the time. I don't think she'll get away with that. But that's where marches and things really do come in. Now, the big march in Glasgow, which was my first march, because in 2014 I was just driving around the country with my husband Hans doing meetings. I never actually got to go to marches. I never sang Caledonia once. That last Saturday in Buchanan Street, I was so looking forward to it. And then Tasmina phones me up and says, could you and Hans drive all the way to Aberdeen to do a meeting? And I missed that one. That was about us. That was about us energising ourselves. It was about us saying to people who've kind of gone a bit lukewarm, you know, you're not on your own, we're still here. If she tried to do that, that is when you want to be having your marches, not in thousands and tens of thousands, but you literally have to be getting every single independent supporter out on the street to make it irresistible.
What demonstrated for me on Tuesday was the power drum. Could you tell me the reason behind the significant increase in the Scottish office? Is this going to be the UK framework powerhouse that will replace the Scottish Government?
Well, I mean, that's something that quite a lot of us suspect, that I don't think they would shut down Holyrood, because I think it would be too aware. That's not how they work. I think they're going to just take the legs from under it. I think they're going to hollow it out. And the fact that the Scottish office was almost ceasing to exist, whereas now it is just growing like Topsy. And if any of you go in and look for it, you won't find it anymore, because it's not called the Scottish office. It's called the UK Government in Scotland. So I think that tells you. Obviously, they are now opening big new premises in Edinburgh, and I think there is definitely a suspicion from some people that what would happen is, what they say is the powers will go back to Scotland. They don't always promise the powers will go back to Holyrood. And they're talking about holding them for 7 years. It's a ridiculous length of time, even if we were in agreement. So yeah, I would agree with your suspicion. I think it is very sinister that the Scottish office is growing in staff, in spend. Its social media spend is now massive. And I don't understand how David Mundell managed to get away with social media work being done in his constituency, and only in his constituency. Now, it wasn't during the official time of a campaign, but how does a minister get away with his department spending money in his constituency campaigning? You know, I'm sorry, I think it's all pretty sinister. But yeah, I would agree with that suspicion.
Okay, one final question. Gentleman here.
We saw all the disrespect on Tuesday night to a partner in a union. Well, we probably need to go down the thought of a referendum of some kind, but instead of a referendum, are anyone looking at the Treaty of Union and how all those breaches taking part are breaking the Treaty of Union? Can that not be used?
To be honest, if we'd never had a referendum, obviously Mrs Thatcher said that if ever Scotland won a general election, or the SNP, then they could simply declare independence. But the problem is, a referendum is the highest measure of popular support. So you can't step back from that and say, right, okay, we lost that, so we're going to do something that's not as democratic the next time, and we're just going to do it. And so unfortunately, while UDI or dissolving the Treaty of Union, or I would go for any of them, but the issue is, if we don't want to be going into a country that's eating itself up in bitterness, it has to be because we have won people over. And there's no shortcut to that. There's no sitting at home being a Twitter warrior at 10 o'clock at night. That's fine, that's fun, that's entertainment. But you do that when you've already been out and done your homework. Chapping doors, or organising a coffee and conversation, kind of indie blethers, whatever, I don't care what you call it. But it's actually just talking to people. And I call this the year of conversation. Because the independence referendum won't happen this year. It might happen as early as next spring, but it won't happen this year. But if we're not already moving our family members who voted no, our neighbours, our colleagues at work, then we're not going to win. And there isn't a shortcut for that, because they're going to be in this country afterwards, and we need them to be working with us, not that we start off a new Scotland that's full of bitterness and people who feel they were tricked or cheated. So, to be honest, I don't see any shortcut other than to get past a referendum.
Thank you, and thank you, Philippa Whitford. Thanks, Philippa. So, Lesley, back to the Growth Commission.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I'd go away with that. No, sorry, we're going back to that.
She did that just to get out of that.
I can see Saskatchewan without starting to stutter, but I can't understand